Welcome back, everyone. It's a fresh day filled with new opportunities, and today marks the beginning of new exciting journey into realm of backend development. Uh, in our previous sessions, we dived into the world of front-end development, exploring HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and React.js. But now it's time to switch gears and dive deep into backend development with MongoDB, Express.js, and Node.js. I am thrilled to introduce our new speaker, Mr. Alok Kumar, who is experienced software engineer at Utkal Labs, who will be guiding us through this wild adventure. Without further ado, let's kickstart this journey without wasting a single moment. Please join me in welcoming Alok Kumar to lead us through today's session on backend development.
Thank you, Manisha. I hope I am audible to everyone. So, good evening, everyone. Last 2 days, you all learned about front-end development, React, HTML, CSS, and the next 2 days we'll be covering back-end development, which is basically Node.js, Express, and MongoDB. So today we'll be mostly learning about theoretical part. So, firstly, who am I? So this is Alok. I'm a full stack developer at Utkal Labs, and I have a working experience of around 3 years. And I'm all about JavaScript. Like I love to talk about JavaScript. I love to write ebooks, blogging, and everything. And apart from that, I love watching anime, writing poems, and listening to music. So without wasting any time, let's see what is the agenda of today. So I have distributed the whole 4 hours into 6 parts. So these 6 parts are: firstly, we'll talk about some JavaScript fundamentals that you need. So we'll mostly brush up the things in an abstract way. After that, we'll talk about Node and Express. What are those? How they are used? Then we'll talk about something called async JavaScript, which is why it is important and how it will help us in writing better code. After that, we'll talk about database, different types of database that we have. uh, what is MongoDB, how it is different from other databases, and how we'll use that for our backend development. After that, we'll create one HTTP server of our own, and we'll design some APIs, and after that we'll call those APIs using Postman or Swagger. And at the last, I'll talk about what next you can explore after this workshop. So let's start with some of the JavaScript fundamentals. So you must have already have some idea of what is JavaScript and different components of it, but we'll just have a look of everything. So mostly I'll be using this slides as the content. So I have some key points written here, and I will use this code editor, VS Code, in order to show you some code and some information. And I'll be using this tool called run.js to run some JavaScript code and show you the output. So let's begin with what is JavaScript. So just like other programming languages that we have, like C, C++, Java, so JavaScript is also a programming language, which is a high-level interpreted language. So what does interpreted languages means that in like unlike other programming languages, we have compilers which compiles the code. After that, it is run. But here JavaScript, it is directly executed in the runtime without being compiled, so which makes it a bit faster. So mostly JavaScript is used to add interactivity to the web pages. For example, we have a web page where we have buttons and everything. So JavaScript is used to add, when we click on that button, it should trigger something, and it will add some interactions to the web page. So earlier JavaScript was mostly used for front end, but now it is also used for backend. So, and also JavaScript is supported by all modern browsers like Chrome, Firefox, and others. Uh, Also, in between, if you have any questions, then please type in the comment box. I'll try to answer them. So let's talk about data types in JavaScript. So we have basically two categories of data types. First is primitive data type, and another one is complex data types. So primitive contains something called string, number, boolean, undefined, and null. So these are similar to what we have in other languages like C++, Java. So how it is different from them. So let me show you some examples of different data types. Let me know if the font is smaller or do you need a bit like bigger. So firstly, we have a string data type, right? So any textual data which is enclosed in a double quotes, that is a string. Similarly, numbers. So number contains here both int and float. Like in other languages, you have like int, float, but in JavaScript, all are called as number only. So a number can store both int data type and also some decimal points. So both are fine in case of JavaScript. The next one is Boolean. So Boolean stores values as like truthy or falsy, which is basically true and false. After that, undefined. So undefined means that a variable is declared, but it is not having any data. So let me show an example. So here I have declared one variable a, but it don't have any value. So when I'll console log a, it will give us undefined. So undefined is a data type. After that, we have null. So null represents that there is an absence of value. So whenever we want to store some empty value to a variable, we can directly store null to it. Now we have some complex data types, which is object, array, and function. So object is basically a key value pair. For example, we have here a person object, right? So we have different key value pairs such as name, which is Alice, and age 25. So thus we create some key value pairs, which is similar to the other programming languages. After that, we have an array. So array is same as different programming languages that we have, which is an ordered collection of elements. Uh, so there are some differences between other programming languages and this one. So I'll talk about it next. And then we have a function, which is basically a block of code to perform a particular task. So here we have a function which just returns a keyword hello. Okay. Is it visible now? Cool. So let's talk about variables. So in JavaScript, we have mostly three keywords to declare a variable. One is var, and other two are let and const. So the only difference is that earlier there was only one, which is var. So in other languages we have different keywords like int, float, string. But in JavaScript we have only one keyword, which is var, which can be used to declare any data type. So we can store, let's suppose, we can also store a string on it. On the same variable, I can also store a number, a boolean. Any data type can be stored in using var only. But later on in ES6, so there were two more keywords introduced. One was let, another was one const. So the difference between these two are that, so let is a block scope. For example, we have a block of code. So any declaration using let a here, so its scope is only between this block only. So after that you can declare again same variable with the same name. But earlier in the case of var, so you can declare var here and you can also access the same variable inside another scope in the same context. Another one is const. So const is basically similar to what it is named, which is constant, right? So whenever you will declare one constant variable, you can't change the value of its again. So for example, if age student is true, later you can't change it. Let me show you through an example. So for example, I have a variable here a where I have stored value 1. So as it is late, we can reassign it with some other value and that will be completely fine. But if we have a const variable and let's suppose I have stored here 12. So if I'll try to again reassign something to it, so it will give a throw that assignment to a constant variable type error. So you can't reassign anything to a constant variable. So this is the basically the difference between let and const. Now moving forward, let's talk about functions. So functions are basically, as it is written, a block of code, right, which performs a particular task. So you can declare function using two ways. One is using function keyword. So you will write function keyword and then name of the function. Then you will give some parentheses and the parameters that the function will accept and the working code of the function. Also, you can create one function and store it in one of the variables. Guys, please let me know which font size you want to be increased, like the slide one or the code editor one. Okay, so basically code editor is more important than the slides. I'll read it aloud, the slides one, if it is not visible that much. Okay, got it. Okay, so what are functions? So functions are basically a blocks of reusable code. So whenever we are declaring one function, we can again call it, reuse it again and again. Okay. So now, function can be declared with a function keyword or as a arrow function. So using a function keyword, we can see here, we'll have to just use a function keyword. After that, the function name variable and the parameters that we are passing and the working code. Similarly, we can store a function declaration inside one variable and then call it again. Like you just have to simply write the variable and you can invoke a function. And the newer way is by using an arrow function. So all you have to do is that you have to give a variable name, after that equal to, then the parameters that you are passing, and after that you have to give this arrow symbol using an equal to and a right arrow, and after that the working code whatever you are returning. So this is a kind of a shorter way to declare a function. And the last one is that can be assigned to a variable and passed argument, which is simply that I've just shown here, that you can assign that function to a variable and use it. uh, the next one is arrays. So let me tell you the difference between the array that you have been using right till now to in other languages and this one. So arrays are basically an ordered collection of elements. So as it is similar to the other languages, right? So you can simply create an ordered collection of elements here. So here I have a collection of strings like apple, banana, orange. Similarly, you can create an collection of numbers. The difference between JavaScript and other languages that you can also mix all those data types together. So now I have an array where I have also one string, one number, and a boolean. Right. So as other definitions are, it can hold elements of different data types that I have just shown you here. Similar to the other languages, it starts from index 0 and goes to ln, And arrays have different built-in methods that can be used to manipulate the data inside them. So let's see some of them. Right. So firstly we have pop. So what push is does that it will add one element to the end of the array. We'll see the working example of all these one by one. Right. So what pop does is that it will remove the last element from the array. What shift does is that shift will remove the first element. Unshift will add one element to the beginning or number of elements to the beginning. Slice will return a portion of the array that you will ask for it. And splice will add or remove element at a specified index. So I have some examples here. Let's check it by running this code. Got it. So we have an array, let's suppose named fruits, which contain two fruits at the time, apple and banana. After that, we can add an element to an array using push. So let's see what fruits contain after a push. So now you'll see that whenever we called the push method and we pushed orange to the array, now orange is added at the last of the initial array. Similarly, let's see what will happen if we'll call the pop function on an array. So whenever we'll call a pop function on an array, so you will see it will return the last element of the array. So earlier it was apple banana. After that we pushed orange in that array. And now whenever we'll call pop, so now the last element is orange, it will return that. And now as pop was used to remove the last element, similarly shift will be used to remove the first element. So now if we'll console log remove 2, here you can see it returns the first element of that array, apple. Now let's talk about unshift. So what unshift does is that it will add elements to the beginning, as shift was used to remove the first element, so it will add some elements to the beginning. So now here we have one example where fruits.unshift grape. So now if we'll check what the fruit contains, so now we have grape and banana. As rest we have already removed using shift and pop. So now fruits already contained banana, and now we have unshifted grape to the beginning of that array. So now the fruits array contain grape and banana. Similarly, we have different functions like slice, which is used to return a portion of the array. So here we are asking earlier, let's suppose the fruits contain grape and banana. Now, if we'll console log subset, it returns banana. So why? Because we asked for the index one. So as we asked for the index one, so it returned the index one in an array that the subset banana. Similarly, we have a splice function. So what it does is that it is used to either remove element or add elements. So here we are adding at index one without replacing any element two fruits, which is kiwi and apple. So now after this, if we'll check fruits, so earlier we had um, grape and banana, these two, right? And now at index 1, without replacing any, we have added kiwi and apple. So kiwi and apple was inserted in between. And as earlier, the last element was banana. So it's still banana. We can also replace, for example, now in this array, I'm adding at index 1, but I'm also replacing one element from it. So as soon as I'll replace the last element, so now we have grape, kiwi, banana as the next element, which was this one. Sorry, grape, kiwi, and pineapple as the next element from index 1 was replaced by these two. So these are some of the methods that comes inbuilt with array and JavaScript that you can use in order to manipulate the data inside the array according to the use case that you have. Let's talk about modules. So modules are basically modular pieces of code for better organization and reusability. So let me explain this with an help of an drawings. So earlier when the JavaScript was started, right? So we had like a single page where you used to write codes and codes and codes. So when the project was smaller, right? So it was not that difficult to manage everything, but as soon as the like projects developed, now we have a bigger code base and the size of the apps were required bigger, so managing everything in a single file was too much difficult. Thus the concept of modules came, where like we can take some piece of code, right, and store it in a different page, right. Similarly, take a different piece of code, store it in a different page, and at last what we'll do, when we'll running the project, we'll again import all those to a single page and run it. So this way what will happen is that we have a smaller chunks of code, so it is, we can better organize it, right. Also we can reuse it. Let's suppose we have a piece of code that is called again and again. For example, here we have a code which is used to fetch some data from the database of a particular user. Later on the application, we again require the same thing, that now we have to get the uh, data of user A. Here also we needed data of user A. So now this piece of code is repeated, but now as this chunk of code is stored in a different file, we can import it from wherever it is needed. So for example, here we need data of A, so we'll import it here. Similarly, if we'll again need the data of A, we can import the same file here also and use it. So this way we the repetition of code is avoided. And the next point is that encapsulate code within its own scope. So it is similar to what we talked about let variable. So it has now its own scope. So you can also declare some variables in this page. For example, let user, right, and also in this page let user. So as both have different scopes, so this will not, whenever will be importing this, right, so its functionality is separated, its functionality is separated, so it will not bring conflict to the both files whenever we are merging it. So there's thus it is that it encapsulate code within its own scope. At it facilitate code separation and maintainability that we just talked about, right, that it helps to maintain code, as now we have the smaller chunks of code separated in different files. And now we have export and import functionality between modules. So let's see one example of it, right. So here I have, right, I have two files. One is greet.js, where we have a function which is taking one name parameter, and what it does, it only returns hello plus that the name that we are providing and an explanation part. And now we are, what we are doing, we are exporting this function as a module. We can also export variables and everything, right. So this way we are exporting a function, and now in this file which is module.js, what we are doing is that we're importing that file grid.js. So now that function that was written here is not assigned to this variable. So as soon as we'll call this grid function, so let me run this code. So as soon as I will run this code, right? So what will it will do? It will firstly come here. It will import the function from grid.js, and then this will run this code. So as soon as I called grid and John, so it went to the function in grid.js. It returned from there hello John plus exclamation mark, and after that when it returned here, it console logged that to our terminal. So that's how basically modules work. You so earlier we could have written the same both functions here only, like instead of having an export.js in other file, we can simply, we could have written this function here only and used it here. But let's suppose we have a bigger function, and as soon as the implementation of those functions would have increased, so it would have been harder for us to manage everything in a single file. Thus the concept of module came, and now we can separate this code to a different files and use it up using import and export. Okay, so we just talked about modules, right? So this is kind of an abstract knowledge of all the JavaScript fundamentals that you will be using in our other next modules or next chapters that will be ready. So if you have guys any questions till now, then please ping in the chat. After that, we'll start with Node and Express. Okay, so repeat module. If you have any specific, got it. Let me pull up one of my blogs that I have written on modules, right? Let me explain it using this, right? Is my screen visible? Right. You can read it, right? Okay. So earlier what was happening, right? We have a single file. Let's suppose is index.js, right? So we have three functions on it: function A, function B, function C, and the implementation of these functions, right? So let's suppose these functions are growing bigger and bigger as our um, project is getting bigger. So now manage all these functions is too much hard for us, right? So what we'll do is that we'll split these into modules. So now we have three modules, and we have uh, written these functions in each separate module. So for example, here export function A is here, function B is in another module, and function C is another module. And now what we are doing is we are simply importing these modules again back to our main index.js file and running it. So the implementation of these two are similar, are same. Only difference is that now this one is well maintained, and as we have a smaller pieces of code, so the debugging will be easier, right? Now we can maintain the code easily, we can change it, modify it easily, instead of this one where we had all the code in a single file. And the benefit is that now you can also import these functions in our main file, but also in different modules. So for example, the function A is also required in module B, right? In function B. So as we have imported function A here, we can also import that same function in module B and use it. Which statements are necessary for using JavaScript modules? Okay. So as you can see here, right? For export, we are using module.exports, and for import, we are using require and that file name. Mm. So this is different in Node.js, but you might have seen in React side, you use export and import, right? So I have few articles written on modules, right? So I will link that in the description, or the repo that I'll be sharing with you, which contains all this code. So you can deep dive, like what is the history of modules, why do we need them, common JS modules, ES6 modules that we just talked about, and how import and export works in React, and some important features of ES6 modules. function B friend function of A. Are JS modules compatible with older browsers? I guess yes. Like modules is not a new concept, right? So it is from the beginning of JavaScript. I guess very initial years. So I guess it is supported with older browsers also. Okay. So any other questions related to fundamentals? Cool. So let's move forward and talk about Node and Express, right? So earlier when JavaScript was invented, right? So its main objective was to run web pages in browsers, right? So let's suppose Chrome. So it there were JavaScript engines, right, which were used to what we call to run the JavaScript code in browsers. So what one day one developer did was that it extracted that JavaScript engine, right, and used it so that we can run JavaScript code outside of a web browser, and thus Node.js came into picture. So let's in this whole topic we'll talk about introduction to Node and Express, and how we can install Node.js and npm in your system, what is REST, what is Express, and we'll talk about router controller and services and middlewares. So let's talk about what is Node.js, right? So JavaScript runtime built on Java, as I said. So there are different JavaScript engines, right, for different web browsers. For example, Chrome uses V8 JavaScript engine. Similarly, I guess Firefox uses a Spider Monkey. So different browsers have different V8 engines, and different JavaScript engines which they use to run the JavaScript code. So as I said, this Node.js is built on Chrome's V8 JavaScript engine, and it uses that thing to run JavaScript code outside of web browser. So there's now JavaScript code can run outside of browser. So we can use this to create server-side development. Earlier it was used only for front end, but now we are able to run this JavaScript outside of a web browser. So now we can use this code, use JavaScript to create web servers, APIs, and everything related to backend. So it supports non-blocking and event-driven architecture, right? So what it is that we'll talk about async JavaScript after this. So where there I will explain in detail about non-blocking event-driven architecture. So it also enabled building scalable and high-performance application. So as now Node.js is available to us, we can create applications which are scalable and high performance. For example, Node.js is not just suitable for smaller applications, but rather it can also support bigger application which has um, thousands and lakhs of users. So guys, any question regarding Node.js? Cool. So let's just talk about a little bit about what is a V8 engine, right? So JavaScript engine that is developed by Google for Chrome browser. So as I said, JavaScript engines, right? So JavaScript engines are basically used to run the JavaScript code out for browsers. So another line is that executes JavaScript code directly to machine code for speed. So in other programming languages, right, so whenever a code is run, right, firstly it is compiled line by line, and after that it is run. But in using V8 engine, that code is directly run using something called JIT. which is just in time compilation, right? So it executes the whole code directly without reading it line by line. What are the parameters of setting up server.js API? Can you please elaborate this question? Like, I didn't get it. Are you talking about how we can initialize a Node.js server or a project? Node API parameters. Okay, so as I can, how is the use of Node.js in backend? Pawan will see how to create server and everything later in this course workshop. So after that, I guess you will get your answer that how we'll be using JavaScript to create backend. And Ernest, which one is API, Node.js or Express? Okay, so Node.js is basically the programming language, for example, that we'll be using, and Express is a framework made for Node.js to make API development easier. If I'm, yeah. So we'll talk about this in detail in the just next slides, where we'll talk about what is Express and everything. Okay, so the last point is that it is used in various applications beyond the browser, including Node.js that we just talked about. That now, as using these engines, we can run JavaScript code outside the browser. So it now supports backend development also. Let's talk about NPM, right? So what is NPM? So do you guys have any idea about what is NPM that you can comment in the chat box? Yeah, Bhargav, I will also share the repo, right? And I've also written one small ebook which covers most of the basics of ES6, like variables and everything. That is like hosted in Gumroad and is totally free. You can download it, and I'll also share the link of my blog channel website where you can read most of the blogs, and mostly all the basics is covered in the ebook and the blogs. Salini Node Package Manager is basically the full form of NPM. But do you guys have any idea about what is NPM and why it is used? Okay, you can say that yes, that NPM manages all environment packages and project dependencies. But let me explain this using the graph that I just made, right? So, for example, we just talked about modules, right? That we can create a small function, right? For example, here greet.js, right? So we have a small function here, greet dot this function called greet, with what it is doing, that it is simply printing one name, right? So let's suppose we have this greet function here, and what we are using is that we are using this function by importing it into different parts of our project and using this greet function. For example, I have one file called index.js where I am importing this greet.js and using it. Now what npm does is that now I have a module, right? It is independent of rest of my project. Its task is to take one parameter and print it, return using adding hello to it, right? So now it, as it is independent to the rest of my project, I can also share this module with other users, right? For example, there is this another guy sitting in different part of my a different part of world, and he has a different project. Let's suppose this one is project A and he has a project B, but he also requires similar function related to grade, right? So now what he does, that I have one store, right, where I can host these modules, independent modules, right? So for example, I have this great module and someone has posted one another module called add, someone has added another module called multiplication, right? So I have this store where different users have posted their modules, independent modules, and now any user and sitting in different parts of world can import from this store. For example, this user B needs greet function, so it will import this function directly to his project. He don't need to know what is happening in this function. He only needs to know what is the implementation, right? So it knows that if he will provide an parameter, it will return hello, and he don't need to know what is the implementation behind the scenes. Similarly, there is a user called C which needed add function. So he saw that the store already contains one add function, right? So what it will do, it will directly import this add function in his project and use it. Now this user don't need to write again the whole implementation of add, and this user don't need to write again the whole implementation of greet. So this store that we have just created where users can upload and users can use, so this is basically npm, right? So if we'll go to the definition, so it is a package manager for node.js that ernest said that people can manage all the variables, environment variables and related to the package. Also, it is used to install, manage and share packages of code that as I said here, we can write modules and just store it, we can install from it, we can manage it, and we can share with other users, right? So npm, there are different other providers also like npm. I guess yarn, it is one of them which is which is popular. There might be others too, but npm is kind of the largest registry in the world, and it also supports dependency management and version control. So what it basically means, let's suppose I have an add module or a package, right? So it is version 1.0.0. So C is using it, but C found that there are some bugs in this package. So he reported to the original user. Let's suppose the original user is D. He reported that there is a bug in your package. So what he did is that he fixed that bug and then he updated it as 1.0.1, right? So now see what C did, that he updated his add package from 1.0.0 to 1.0.1, and now the bug is fixed and he can use it. So thus the npm came that it supports dependency management and version control. So are you guys clear about npm? Okay, so let's next talk about how you guys can install node.js and npm in your computer, right? So with that is very much easier. You just simply have to go to your this node.js website, which is I guess nodejs.org, right? And whenever you will go, you can simply find this download nodejs.lts, and it will download the whatever it is suitable for your computer, that setup, and you just simply install it. So I've already installed it right in my computer, and if you want to check whether it is installed in your computer or not, it is very easier. Just go to command prompt. Okay, is it visible? So you can simply write node dash v. So it will tell you the version of Node.js installed in your computer. So for me it is 16.0.0. So let's suppose node is not installed in your system, right? uh, so it will return something. It will not return the version, rather it will return something error or different message, right? Similarly for npm, you can check npm dash v, right? And it will return you the version of npm that is installed in your system. For me it is 7.1 7.10.0. Right? So similarly you can check in your system whether it is installed or not, and if not, you can simply go to this website and download the installer and install it. It is pretty much simple, but if you face some problem, there are like tons of videos on YouTube. You can find how to install Node.js. So please install it, as like in the next class we'll be writing some code, and I'll hope that you will follow along. So for that you will be needing Node.js in your system in order to run and test everything. Any questions regarding installing Node.js and npm? Got it. So let's move forward, and let's take a rest of 2 minutes. Sorry, kidding. So let's talk about rest. Okay. So do you guys have any idea about what is rest? Ernest, I'll go into Express, right, just after this slide where we'll talk about how to install it and everything. Okay. So what is REST is basically, so REST is an architectural style for designing networked applications. So whenever basically backend contains APIs, right? Server and API. So APIs are endpoints that will be hitting, and it will be returning some data, or it will be creating, or we can interact with the database basically, right? So REST is a set of principles that tells us how to design those APIs, right? So REST using REST is a kind of set of principles that tells us how to design those APIs. It tells us which HTTP methods we can use. Like for example, the most common are get, post, put, delete. Get is used for retrieving our data. Post is used for creating some data. Put is for updating, and delete is, as the name suggests, for deleting. Right. So resources as identified by URLs. So basically, you will have to write some URL or endpoints using which we will be hitting or identifying which API we need to hit, which HTTP method we'll be using, right? So REST also promotes scalability, simplicity, and modifiability. So basically, if we'll be using REST, so it will be easier for us to scale our project. It will be simple, right? And it will be can be easily modified, right? So moving to next, Express.js. So let's talk about what is Express.js, right? So Express.js is a web application framework for Node.js, right? So Node.js is the code that we'll be writing, right? And the kind of programming language that we'll be using in order to write our server code or API. And Express.js is a web application framework which will be used to create our server and API. Okay. So I will show you how we will be using simple node, right, tomorrow, to create a node server, and also how we'll be using Express.js to create the same thing. Okay, so it facilitates building web server and API. Simple as the it suggests that we can use Express to create servers and APIs. So Express.js simplifies implementing RESTful principles, which is very simpler, as it suggests that we can use Express.js, and so whatever we just talked about REST.js, like the set of principles, how we should design an API, how we should use methods, and how we have to use URLs. So Express.js make it is very easier to implement all this, right? As different methods that we talked in REST, get, post, put, delete. So Express.js allows to define these routes. We'll talk about routes just after that. So it allows to define these routes and write these HTTP methods. So Express.js also makes it easier for handling the request that is coming from client, right? And the response that we are sending to the client according to the RESTful conventions. Okay. Any question regarding Express? Let me explain a bit about it, right? S- I should have explained it earlier, but let's see. So we have a, let's suppose a screen, right? A laptop screen where we are showing some tables. Sorry for my bad drawing. I'm not good at it, but let's. So we have some tables in the screen, right? Where we are showing some data. Okay. So this is front end, right? And now whenever the data that we are showing, we have one database, right? This database contains all the data that related to users, payment, products, and everything that we need to show in this website. So this is the database, right? So database is containing all the data that we need to show. Front end is showing that data, and the mediator between these two is our server, right? So let's suppose I have one server here, and how this server coordinates between these two, using API. So let's suppose there is an API, get API, which is name is get you product data, right? So this front end will hit one API, right? So it will hit one API and ask for the product data. Now what server will do? It will accept the request from the client. It will then fetch the required data from the database, right? It will fetch the data from the database, and once the server has the data, using the same API, it will return that data to the front end, and the client will show the received data in the table, right? So basically front end in MERN, that so you learned about React, right? So React, you created this front end part using React. Now we'll be using MongoDB, which is our database, right? And Node and Express to create this thing, our server and the APIs that will be required to coordinate between database and front end. Okay. So REST, what does REST defines some set of principles of how this API should be created, which methods should be we have to use. So for example, when we are fetching one data from the server or database, so what kind of method we should use for that API. If we are sending creating a new user, and we are sending that user data to server, and then server is storing that data to the database, right? So what kind of method we should use then. So all these things is kind of set of principles is set by REST of how we should design the data, right? And now what Express.js is does that it uses this REST conventions, and using Express we will create this server and APIs. Is it can you like it is bit easier to understand now using this graph, like what we are trying to do? How we connect the server with front end using APIs that I just talked about. So the connection between our front end and server is this APIs that we have, using which will be transferring data between these two. Express is used for create API. Is it correct? Yes, Megan. Megan. So we'll be using Express to create APIs also, and this server also. Right. APIs are basically set of APIs, but without server we can't use it to host it, right? So for example, let's suppose you have one website that you have created in your computer, right? But other people which are sitting in different computer, they can't access that website, either it is in your computer only as local file. So what you do is that you host that website using some uh, uh, what you providers like Netlify or different thing, and after that people can access those website, right? So similarly, APIs are just endpoint, but using server will open one port, and people can access these APIs using that server. uh, am I clear? What is the difference between REST and REST? Both are same, Ernest. So REST is the kind of we are saying that mm, one is like the name, right? REST. And another is like an adjective that we are calling this API is RESTful. Similar. What is middleware? Yeah, we'll talk about it just after a few slides. Any more questions? So are we clear about what is front end, what is back end, and what we are trying to create, right? And again, sorry for my bad drawing. Cool. So before talking about router and the rest of the things, let's take a 5-minute break. Um, you can drink water or anything. Just have a 5-minute walk, and let's join again after 5 minutes. That's cool. Okay. Hi everyone. Sorry for the interruption. Okay, let me take the questions first. Okay, the first one is I guess Swati, why we are not using database in front end. Okay, so Swati, we can use database in front end, which is called local database, right? So basically that is same thing as like having a local project, right? So now the database is your system only, you are using it, but when you will be creating an application for the whole world, right? So you need a centralized database somewhere in order to so that the other users can also use that same database to store data and fetch data from it. Like, did that answer your question? Okay, so can you compare and contrast Express.js with other Node.js frameworks like Kova and Happy.js? So artistic Murtika. So I have not used Kova.js and Happy.js, but I'll consider this question and I'll look into it and I'll answer these questions tomorrow. Is that fine? Is there any handshake method between a Okay, how does Express.js handle request and response object? We'll see just after this slide, right? Router controller and services. Is there any handshake method between API and database to retrieve data from DB? Yeah, so we have different things called ODM and ORMs, right? Which are used to create a relationship which we use in order to get data from the database. Like it's kind of a bridge between your server and the database, using which we can add data, create data, or get data. We'll talk about it ODM in detail just after, I guess, in the database section. Okay. How does Express.js handle request? How can we deploy Express.js application to a production environment? Yeah. So there are different platforms, right? For example, Amazon's AWS EC2, using which we can deploy our uh, what we say the server. There is an easier way, right? That I will show you if we get time tomorrow, or I will just leave you the resources using which you can do that. You can create your own laptop as a server, right? And you can share your server to different people that they can use it. So your laptop will act as a server, your local database will act as a centralized server that people can use. But that is not recommended for the productions that are alive. That is only recommended while you are developing and you just need to test something, right? So if you want to deploy your server so that people can use it and that can be used in a live app, for that you need some services like AWS or Google's GCP or something like that. Next is there any intermediate between server and DB? Yeah, that I talked about, Ganesh, that can we use Postman here? Yeah, we'll be using Postman tomorrow when we'll be testing our APIs that will be created. What is connection pooling and why is it important Java backend development? So Sani, I don't have much idea about Java backend development, but as far as can I know, the context of connection pooling is like how many connections can be like how many connections can be created at a time with a database, if I'm not wrong. I guess I'm done with the question. So let's move forward as we have a lot of things to cover. Cool. So let's talk about router. Okay. So what are basically router? So as we the rest says that you need to have URLs, a specific URLs in order to identify your resources or APIs, right? So using router will be defining those routes, right, to handle the incoming HTTP request from the client side, and it will also map those URLs to the specific controller actions which will decide what will happen to that request, what the response will be there sent to the client, right? The last one is used to organize and manage endpoint logic, which is similar to like how the endpoints that will be creating, so how we'll be organizing and managing those. So let me show you an example, right? Okay, so this is just an example of REST methods, right? So that how we can define the endpoints. So something like get will be API slash users, which kind of indicate that this is an API using which will we are getting the users. Similarly, API slash users, but post method. So this indicates that we are trying to create one user using this API. Similarly, API slash users colon ID. So this indicates that we're trying to update a given ID of a user. Sorry, a given user of the given ID. We're trying to update that user's details. Similarly, we're trying to a given delete a given user with the help of the ID of that user. So this is how the endpoints are. The how REST suggests that the API's endpoints should be. Then we talked about Express.js. So this is what code you need to just start a HTTP server. You just need to as we so here Express is a package, right? You can simply I'll show you how to install Express and everything tomorrow. So here just like we are just kind of having an overview of everything, right? So you just need to import the Express package that I have installed from npm, and then I'm initializing it in an variable called app. Then here I am creating one API, which is a get API. Now here I am defining one endpoint, and now here I have one function that will decide what will happen to when we'll hit this API, which is basically called controller that we'll just see. And after that, I'm just kind of hosting this server that I've just created in 3000 port of our laptop, right? We'll see how we'll create these servers and run it. So this is about how we'll be using REST and Express to define the APIs, right? So here you can see we have different I'm using the app that I've just Express app, and then I'm defining the get method that the methods get, post, put, delete. Then I have the endpoints, right? What will be the endpoint that will be hitting, and after that the controller or the working function that will decide what will happen when we'll hit this API. For example, here we'll have implementation of getting all the users. Here we'll have implementation of creating a new user. Similarly, update, delete, and then we are starting that Express server. Yeah, yes, Sandhya, at localhost 3000. Right. So now let's talk about router. So earlier, what was happening is that using that app direct only, that Express app, we were defining the functions, the methods. But now, when router comes into picture, you can create a separate module, right? And there we have one method called router. So what router is that? It, as the name said, it just routes that incoming request to a specific controller. Okay. So now I have one controller, right? So this is basically a controller. This function that we had here, this one. So this is a controller that will decide what will happen to the incoming request. So we are moving this to a different module, right? And we are calling that controllers. So in routers, what we have, using router, we are defining the method, the endpoint, similar to this one, right? And we are passing that to a controller. So whenever someone will call a get API, hit this get API slash users, it will go to this get all users controller, and after that, whatever that is mentioned or implemented in this controller, it will happen, and accordingly it will send the response to the client which has hit your slash users API. Okay, any doubt in router? Pawan, why 3000? It's not like compulsory that you have to host it in 3000 only. So there are a lot of ports in your system, and you can there are ways to check which are free. So basically, what I prefer is that I use 3000 for front end development and 8000 for back end development. So it is not compulsory to use any specific port. Yeah, Mike, you are right. So any question related to router? Cool. So let's talk about controllers. Right. So what is controller? So controller is basically something that contains the logic for handling a specific HTTP request. So any request that is coming, right? So for example, get, post. So controller contains that logic that what will happen to that request. How will analyze what will happen to the request means what will do with the request, and what the response will send to the client. So that logic is written in the controller, right? So controller interacts with models to fetch or manipulate data. So we'll talk about models in database. So basically models are something using which you will be interacting with the database. So controller interact with the models to fetch or manipulate data from the backend database, and also it is also responsible for deciding what is the appropriate response to the client request. Okay, uh, so let's see some code about controller, right? So we'll talk about what is service, right? So we are simply as we talked about modules, please go through that modules blog, right? As modules are a very key aspect or key factor that you need to understand, as like most of the things that we'll be using in doing in Node.js all are kind of based on modules, how we are creating functions, exporting it, importing it, using it, right? So now I have a separate JS file, right, where I'm writing all the controllers, and I'm exporting it and then using it in our router, right? So here, if you'll see, I have one user controller file where I have all the controllers. I'm exporting that controller from that file and then using it here, right? So I have two controllers here, which is get all users and create user. So which have access to the request and response. So request contains all the requests that it coming from the client, and response is something that will decide what we are sending to the client, right? So here as example, I'm fetching some users and I'm sending that users as a JSON data type, sorry, not data type, as a JSON to the client. Similarly, there are different status codes that we'll also talk about tomorrow. Different status codes are there for like deciding what kind of response we are getting from backend. For example, 200 is for a success response, 400 is 401 is for like unauthorized. 404 is something that you might have seen a lot of times, like no content found. Okay. So here we are deciding what we are doing with the request, right? And what we are doing with the response, right? Any questions regarding controller? Controllers code written in separate JS file. Yeah, as I said, modules. So please read about modules more. How many types of error code? Okay, so there are a lot of uh, codes that is used for error. One is that mostly uses 500, which is internal server error. Similarly, there are other kinds of error also. There are a long list for it. I don't also remember all the codes. You can always refer to that list that you can find in internet and use it accordingly to your use case. So let's talk about services. Right. So services are basically to encapsulate reusable business logic and functionality. Let me read all these definitions, and after that, I will explain this. Right. It provide a layer of abstraction between controller and data models, promote code reusability and maintainability. Let me explain this using a diagram. Okay, so let's suppose, right, we just talk about controller, right? So we have a controller, right, and a database. And now, as I said, we have something called model, using which we can interact with that database, right? So let's suppose in the controller here, we had one thing called get all users, right? So let's suppose, just allow me a second, right? So here we have, let's suppose we are using one model called get users, right? Which is simply returning that user. And similarly, let's suppose in create user, we have a new requirement that we can only create 10 users in this application. So how we'll know that we can only create 10 users? So firstly, we'll have to get a list of all the users that are already present in our database, right? After that, we'll check that how many users are there. If there are 10, then we'll not allow. We'll send something. We'll send some status message that it is not allowed. But if it is less than 10, then we'll create one user, right? So let's suppose we are implementing that model here only in the controller, right? So will you be creating model dot get user here also, and here also model dot get user. So now the fact the like the what we say here, in order to use code reusability, what we can do that we can again move this model implementation to a different file, right? As it is same here also, here also. So we have to minimize the repetition of code as much as possible. So there the concept of services came. So what services does that, it will handle the communication with the database using models, right? And now the controllers can interact with the services. So instead of directly uh, uh, interacting with the database using the model, what we'll do now, we have one more layer called service, right? So service will interact with model, and model will interact with database, and now the controller will interact with the services. So what is the benefit of this is that now we can create independent services. For example, get user. Now this get user service, what it is happening is that it is simply getting some users from the database and returning it. Now if there are different controllers that need that same data, now we can directly use this service at all those places instead of repeating this implementation where we'll have to call the model and everything. We have to repeat this code, right? So thus you can see here, right? So we have here, we have one service called get all users and create user. Let's see the implementation of those services, right? So here is, we have one model called user. We'll see how these models work and we'll create one tomorrow, right? So here and some operations related. So just understand that we have user.find, right? What it is doing is that it is using a user model and finding all the data inside it. So what get all users is doing, that it is simply finding all those users and returning it. Similarly, create user, what it is doing, that it is using that model and creating one new user. And after creating, it is returning that same to the what whoever called this create user. So again here we are creating a module, right, and some functions, and we are exporting it from here and then using it in our controllers. Got it? So to sum up these things, right, we have an endpoint, right? Let's suppose API. So whenever a client hits this API, it goes to a route which handles this endpoint and it connects to a controller, right? This controller then hits an server, passes the control to a service, and this services using a model interacts with the database. Using a model, it interacts with the database, and thus the whole cycle, like execution, the flow of code happens. A client hits an API, which is an router endpoint, which then communicates with a controller, then service, then using a model to a database, and then this database returns data to service. Service will return to controller, and this controller will return again back to the client. So this is the whole cycle of movement of data. Any question regarding this all? What is async await, sir? Can you? Yeah, I'll explain this in the next section, that we have async JavaScript. I have a separate section for async await. So any questions regarding this whole cycle? I guess not. Uh, let's move forward then. So someone asked about middlewares, right? So let's talk about middlewares. Okay. So middlewares are simple functions, right, that have access to the request and response whenever an API is hit. Okay. So they are executed in the order they are defined in applications request response cycle. So middleware are something that can be uh, inserted in this section, right, between the API endpoint and the controller, right? So middlewares basically are functions which can be inserted between the execution flow of request and response, right? And it has access to the request and response. It can also modify the request it has and the response objects. Okay, and it can also end the request response cycle here only. It has control of all those things. It can decide whether it will allow it to go to the next cycle, or it can directly end this middleware, right? So it can directly end the execution here only and return to the client. Okay. So it is used for tasks such as logging, authentication, error handling, and data parsing. So one common example is that, right? For example, Let's suppose a client is calling one API, for example, in Flipkart or Amazon, right? So you are calling an API get products, but you are not logged in, right? So what this middleware will do, it has a function where it will check whether that incoming call, the user is eligible or not to access these resources, the products that is stored in the database, right? So it will check here. If the user is eligible, right, it will allow it to the cycle to go next controller, and it will go fetch the product and return to the client. But it will see that this middleware, this client is not eligible to access those resources, right? So what it will do, it will directly terminate that process here only, and it will return some error message to the client that you are not authorized to access these resources. Or you can change your implementation, right? So for example, you might have seen in different applications, whenever you try to access some content which is only available to the logged in users, it opens up the sign up page automatically, right? In order to access these files, you need to be a signed user, and it just automatically opens that your sign up page, from where you signs up, create, you become an eligible user, and after that you are able to access those contents. So all those things are handled by these middlewares, right? So when you tried to access those API, so this middleware hinted back that you are not an authorized user. What the front end developer did is that, based on this request response that he is not an uh, eligible user, what he did is that he just opened that sign up page for you. Did you get that middleware part? Please explain file flow. Sakshi, can you please elaborate your question a bit? I didn't get it. Sir, can you say again how to avoid repetition of code? Ganesh, to answer your question in one word using modules. If you see that a piece of code is again repeated, just strip that part of code to a separate file, export from there, make it in a way that it is independent of the rest of the process, and then import it and use it whenever you need. What about error handling? Yes, Murtika. So error handling is a separate thing that I'll discuss tomorrow. So middlewares and what do you say? Mm, right. Using async JavaScript will be handling the error between happening between this whole process, between maybe database, maybe sometimes the database fails, or sometimes the server crashes. So how we will be handling all those errors? Sir, means creating separate code files and using them according to you. Yeah, just as I explained in the modules part, whenever you find that a same code is used again and again, so also please try catch method. Yeah, I'll talk about all this in the next. All your questions, I guess, is related to async JavaScript, that I'll just discuss in the next section, just after this. Okay, so this is middlewares. Let me show you some code. Okay. So here we have one function called logger, which is simply just logging the request method, and it has access to three functions, three parameters: request, response, and next. Request is basically the request body that is coming from the client. Response is the object that will be sending to the client, and next is a function that is used to pass the control to the next middleware or the controller. So we can directly use it in our like parent label, right? Or we can use it in our API, as I shown you in the diagram, right? We can put it before controller between controller and the API endpoint. So now whenever someone will hit this get API users, though the control will go to this function logger, right? And after that, whatever the implementation is there implementing that, it will call the next, right? So it will move the control to the next controller. Let's suppose we can add more than one middleware here. For example, we have one more middleware called auth, right? So whenever we'll call next, so it will pass the control to the auth middleware. Similarly, auth will have some implementation and next. After that, it will go to your controller. And instead of next, we can also write here like uh, if no request body, right? So I'm just writing pseudo code if no request body, right? Then instead of going next, right, I will directly return I will directly return, sorry, error, right? So whenever when someone will hit this API, it will go to logger, it will check that a request body is not there, right? So it will directly send the response to the client error. It will not run this line. Thus when next is not called, it will not go to the controller. Sir, can we get this? Yeah, yeah, sure. I'll just create a PDF for this slides, and it will. I will just share one repo, right? It will in the README file. You will find everything, all these code and resources, blog, ebook, this PDF, and everything. Backend looks like a little bit hard to learn. It will take more practice to learn in a proper way. Yes, Sandhya. So for most of the people, backend is bit boring, as you don't see a lot of UI stuff going right. In front end, you see you create a button, you just parallelly see a button is created, you create a picture and everything. You have lot of things you can interact with. But backend is basically more of related to data, how data is stored. But without backend, front end will be a very much less use, right? So you can say that you have a TV but you don't have any channels, you don't have any movies to show. So as much as front end is important, backend is also that much important also. Once you will get a hang of it, you will create more and more APIs, you will learn how to interact with database, how to modify the data according to what the front end needs, right? So you will create more and more interest and you will enjoy it. Like I've been doing this since 3 years and I don't think I'm bored till now. Okay, so any questions regarding Node.js and Express? Otherwise, I'll move to async JavaScript, as we have very much less time and I need to finish this. Any questions? Also, I'll be giving a very brief overview of async JavaScript, right? But I have written some blogs that you can read, which has a very detailed information about promises, async JavaScript, and everything. So you can go to this blog, and also the book you can go and you can read about detail about everything. Can you give the overview of all you are teaching now? Uh, okay, maybe tomorrow, if we get time, I'll just give a small overview using graphs, everything. Okay, so let's start with async JavaScript, right? So the first one is sync versus async. Right, so firstly, before reading about async JavaScript, let's talk about what is synchronous code and asynchronous code. Okay, so let's first talk about what is synchronous code. So synchronous code is basically the codes which are executed line by line, right? So let's suppose we have three lines of code. So firstly, the first line will be executed. After that, second line, and then third line. It blocks the execution until the task is completed. So until and unless the first line is executed completely, the control will not go to the second line, right? Only if when the first line is executed completely, then it will go to the second line and then third line. So as it runs line by executed line by line, so it is simple to understand and it is easier to debug. So it may cause blocking in IO bound. So if there are some tasks that is related to input output, right? So for example, as it is blocking the execution, right? So until and unless one task is completed, it is not going to the next one. So it may block your all the tasks, right? So for example, in a queue, if one task is taking too much time, right? So the rest of the task that is pending, so it will be also blocked, right? And let's talk about what are asynchronous codes, right? So asynchronous codes are not some those codes which are not executed completely line by line, right? So for example, if line one is taking such some time, it will just move from the main process, right? And it will go to the next line, it will start executing that, right? So this helps to execute different operations at a time concurrently, right? As it is not waiting for a task to be completed in order to go to the next one, right? So this way it doesn't block the execution of program. And as there are times when we need to handle some asynchronous code in a way like uh, it helps you to let me explain this within a drawing, right? Okay. So let's suppose we have three lines of code: A, B, and C, right? So in synchronous, what will happen is that, okay, so firstly it will run A, then B, then C. Okay, but let's suppose B is an asynchronous code and it takes some time to complete, right? So what will happen in synchronous, that it will wait till B get completed, then it will run C. But in asynchronous, let's suppose it has started, gets completed, now B is taking some time. So even B is continuing, it already starts C. So now we have some three processes that are running concurrently along with each other, right? But for let's suppose individual thing, right? For individual, this request B, right? So there is an API, right, where we are fetching some data from a database. So getting that data from database is a time taking task, right? So we can't simply just move from one line to the next one here, right? We have to wait for data to be fetched from database, then only we can send to the client. Otherwise, what will happen, that client will hit an API, will create one, will start to fetch data from the database, but even before that data is fetched, we'll send that response back. So as we are sending that response back, we don't have the data from the user data to send to the client. So it will send some error or undefined or empty data, right? So to handle these situations where we need to wait, right, we'll use some techniques called like callback, promises, or async await, that I guess someone was asking from a long time, right? So we'll see how we'll be using these three things in order to handle asynchronous code. And this is suited for IO bound tasks, and it prevents blocking. It does not block the code. Okay. So let's see this using some code. Okay. Right. So sorry. Okay. Here I have three lines, right? One, two, and three. which is simply consoling 1, 2, 3 line by line. So let's run this code, right? So can anyone guess what will be the output? Yes, 1, 2, 3. So let me run this and you get 1, 2, 3, right? But let's suppose now we have some code which is something like this. Okay. So we are consoling 1, right? After that, this is called set timeout, right? So meanwhile, please guess the output this time. Okay. So what set timeout does that? It runs a given function after certain interval of time. Okay. So here I'm running this function after 3 seconds. So this parameter is in milliseconds. Okay. And after that, we have another simple console log 3. So if I'll run this code, right? So, okay, let me run this code and show you the result. So what you saw, it ran first line console log 1, right? It started the second one, but this time in here it was running just one by one, but here it was taking 3 seconds in order to run this line. So what it did, it just passed that and it console log 3, and after 3 seconds it gave the output 2, right? So someone asked whether Node.js is synchronous and asynchronous. So now you got that, you got your answer, right? So by default, Node.js is asynchronous. Okay, it doesn't wait for this to get completed. Rather, it just the flow of the execution moves to the next line, right? And this is now running separately from the main flow. And once it is completed, then it again comes back to the main flow and returns the data. Got it? So this is basically the difference between sync and async. So now let's see that now this, let's suppose this is a code that is fetching data from backend, right? And here we are sending the data back to the, what we say, the client. Now we have already sent, but we don't have the data yet, right? So here we have to wait for this thing to be completed so that when we will send this data, right? So the client must get the data of the users. So let's see how we can um, use different techniques like callbacks and everything in order to achieve that. So what are callback? So callback are simply, you can say, functions that are passed as arguments to other functions, right? So when we are passing one function to a other function as an argument, okay, then that function is called callback function. So using callback, we can execute asynchronously after a task is completed. Used for handling asynchronous operation and event-driven programming, allows controlling the flow of code execution. As I said, using callback, we can control the flow of how it is going, and we can manage the asynchronous tasks. So let's see how we will be using callback. Okay. So let me go. Uh, can you see the code, right? So here I have just um, a little bit tweaked the code, right? So now we have, instead of one start, then we have one function called display middle, which console log middle, right? And we have one function display end, okay, which is console log end. And then we have the set timeout. So here we were directly writing the function in the set timeout. Here we have just written that separately and then calling it here. It is the same thing, right? Same code. And again we are calling display end. Okay, so when we'll run this, right, it will kind of give the same result as earlier. So if we'll run callback, so it returned start end, and after 3 seconds it returned middle, same as the last one, right? 1 3, and after that 2. Now how we can solve this thing using callback? So I'm just commenting it, and also how we can do that using callback function. Right, we have the same implementations, right? Now earlier display middle was just a function. Now here what is happening, display middle is taking a callback function as a parameter. Okay, and after the implementation of display middle function is completed, now we are again calling that callback function, right? So the same thing is happening. What we are doing is that we are passing display end function as a callback to display middle function. So now can anyone guess what will be the output? Let me run it while your comments get shared. Okay, so now you can see that firstly it console start, after that it called display middle, right? And as soon as display middle function was called, so it waited for 3 seconds. After that it console middle, I'm set timeouts, take some time. And when this implementation was done, after that this callback function, which was display end function, was called, and which simply consoled end. So now using callback, right, we are handling this asynchronous code in such a way that it is behaving like a synchronous code. So did you get what is callback and how it is? So this is simply as when you are passing one function to another function, okay, as an argument, and then that when the initial function's implementation is done, then you are calling that function, the callback function. This way you are maintaining the synchronicity of the code. I hope you understood this part, right? Guys, I know attendance is important, but we are just 2 slides left. So if you'll cooperate, that will be finished very soon, and then you can take your attendance and go. Okay. So let's talk about callback hell, right? So this happens when we have nested callbacks. For example, you are passing one function as an argument to the other function, and you're repeating the same thing again and again. Someone mentioned as loop, right? So it is kind of creating a loop. Okay. So this is common in asynchronous programming when we are handling a lot of operations, asynchronous operations sequentially. So this creates a problem where like it makes the code harder to understand. Okay, and it is difficult to maintain and debug. Okay, so let me show you a small code of callback hell, right? So I'll be not running this code and showing you the output. Just take a few seconds and try to understand what is written here. Yeah, dead cell promises are also used to solve callback help. Yeah, that is the next slide actually. Okay, so the callback hell and recursion. Okay, um, so recursion is when we are calling the self, the own function again and again, and callback is passing. Okay, so I guess we can say both are similar, but assume that right, callback hell is kind of, yeah, we can say they're kind of similar, but I don't know whether we can say both are exact same thing, right? So let me tell you a little bit about what is written here. So we have one function called load, which takes a data and a callback, and it calls the callback, invoke the callback function again with some parameter. And in the second line, it is just consoling that data, right? So when we'll execute this code, right? So firstly, it is calling the load function, okay, with a data alloc, and after that, it has a function callback function. So we'll call it. It will print alloc, and it will again call this callback function with a parameter right. So now we'll enter this part, and if sign is right, then again call this load function, right? Again it will go inside this function, it will console log aman, and it will pass this callback function, and again it will call with a parameter right, sign right? So it will check if sign is right, if as we are passing right this time. So again it will call this load function, right? So it will print Rajan, and then it will call this callback function. This time we don't have any conditions like if, so it will simply console log done, and it like doesn't call the function again, right? So even explaining this small code, it is difficult, right? Even understanding it is difficult. So now imagine there are a lot of for loops inside it, and API calls are there. We are fetching data from database, right? So imagine if we have all those implementation in this. So how much complicated this will become to implement, to modify, to debug, and to maintain, right? So as someone mentioned, to solve this problem, promises came into picture, right? So let's talk about what are promises. Okay. So promises are same as real life promises, right? So when we promise someone to do something, there are two output of that. Either will fulfill that promise or will not fulfill that promise. Okay. So as it is said, it represents the eventual completion or failure of a synchronous operation and its resulting value. Okay. So basically, when we'll use a promise on a synchronous operation, so either it will complete or fail, and it will result one value. Okay. So it provides a cleaner alternative to callback for handling asynchronous operation, thus saving us from callback hell. Also, as nesting callbacks were harder for us, so it provides chaining. So now you can chain multiple promises together, right? And it will make sequential operations making easier, and it also allows to handle success and error cases separately. So let's see some code related to promises, right? So we can create a new promise using keyword promise and new, right? So now we have a function, right, which have two parameters. One is resolve, one is reject. Okay. So either if you are doing some implementation and you think that it is completing successfully, you can resolve this promise, or if you think there is an error, you can reject this promise, right? So if I'm running this code, right, so the first function in dot then, so whenever you create one a promise and then store it in a variable, this can be anything like promise one, promise two, any variable, right? So after that, whenever that promise is completed, you will use dot then keyword. So dot then keyword will handle whatever happens once the promise is settled. Okay. So the first function is the resolver, which is basically whenever the function will be completed successfully, and another function is error, which is when it is rejected, right? So in this case, if x is 3 resolved true, so this line will run and it will return true, and error will not run as there is no error. But if I change it to 2, then it will not go to the resolve, rather it will reject this promise, and it will return, it will go to this line and it will return false, and it will not run this the resolver part. Okay. We can also, instead of passing two functions to promise, we can also handle it using catch, right? So we have promise dot then our resolver, which is resolving uh, whatever success message we are sending, right? And then we have one dot catch. So any whenever a promise is rejected, it will directly be thrown to catch and it will handle your error. Okay. And now let's suppose you have sequential, right? So you can do chaining. For example, promise dot then something happens. Then again you can implement dot then, right? Again, if you have some or implementation dot, then again you can call dot then, and at last you will have dot catch. So if in any of the dot then, if there are any errors, it will be automatically catched by this catch function. Did you get a little bit about idea the promise? I know we have just crossed 2 hours, but just one slide is left, and you can read in detail about a promise from the blogs that I'll be sharing. Okay. So moving forward, only part is left is async await, right? So just let's talk in brief about it, right? So async await was introduced in ES 2017 for asynchronous programming. So what it does that it allows us to write asynchronous code in a synchronous looking manner. So if you see here promises, right? So it's a bit lengthy creating a new promise and everything, right? But what async await does that it helps us to write our promises in a synchronous way, like line by line execution, right? So if you'll read the third part is that it works with promises more conveniently. The async keyword defines a function as asynchronous, and await is used to wait for a promise to resolve. Let me explain this with an example. Right. So for example here, we have a function, ignore this part for now, right? So we have one function fetch data. What it is doing that it is calling one API, right? And it is getting some data and it is consoling that data. Okay. And now we are calling that function. So this fetch function will take some time as it is calling one API, right? And then fetching that data and returning it. So it will take some time. So in order to convert it, so what we could have done, we could have created a promise for this, right? And when it has been resolved, then we could have consoled it. But instead of that, what we can do, we can use async await. So first is the function, the parent function, in which you are going to wait for some another like to synchronous code to complete. You will have to make it as an async function, right? So using async keyword, you can denote that this function is async. Now whatever the code that you have, that will be a asynchronous code, you will have to put it inside try. So anything that breaks in try, it will throw that to the catch, similar to what we are doing in promise, right? So if this code breaks, right, so it will be thrown to this catch function. it will take the error whatever it is thrown, and it will console log it. So now we are using await to wait for this process to be completed. So now when we call this fetch data, it will come here, right? It will execute this line. So it will wait till this line is completed execution. It will return data, then it will response it. So this way we can write promises in a better way, right? So fetch will return a promise and it will wait until that promise is resolved, whether it is like any response that we get or any error it returns. But until it will be resolved, it will wait for it, and after that it will do whatever it is implemented. So this is how async await works, right? Okay, so before I leave, I'll just today we talked about fundamentals, Node and Express, and async JavaScript. Tomorrow we'll have a look at database, right? And we'll create our own small server and what you can explore next. Okay, so let's see what is the database. So in database, we'll tomorrow we'll see different types of databases. What is MongoDB and Atlas, right? What is an ODM models that we like talked about today, and then we talked about operations. We'll talk about operations. Then we'll create one small server. HTTP server will see how it is set up, a different file structure. Meanwhile, guys, please put your questions. I'll try to answer that. Then we'll talk about node-moon router controller services that we already talked about, but we'll implement it. Then we'll see, we'll create 4 different APIs. So create, read, update, delete, which is simply called CRUD. And then we'll test those APIs using Postman. Okay. So any questions? Okay. Please share this Canva PPT. Yeah, I'll share it. Recursion is a function that okay. Today topic is MongoDB Express and Node, but you can sorry Vaibhav, I didn't get your question. Sir, will you get we will get the PPT as well along the notes that you said. Yeah, Asu. So I'll share the link of this repo, right? And the GitHub repo where I'll be hosting these codes that I've written here. Okay. In the README file, you will find the link of this Canva PPT, also the blogs and the ebook that I mentioned. Okay. Sure. Can you explain shallow and deep copy in JS? Okay, Vaibhav, I'll cover this tomorrow. But I guess I have already written one article on that. I guess I have a lot of articles on JavaScript, right? So if you will go to this, so I have some articles related to React, um, related to equality or JavaScript types, how JavaScript works, promises, modules, classes. There are a lot of articles that I've written, so you can go and I'll explain. I guess 2 3 questions that I've noticed. One was related to comparison between different frameworks similar to Express.js. One was how recursion and callback are related or similar, and this one is shallow copy and deep copy, right? So I'll cover this at the beginning of tomorrow's session. Wait use for fetch type. Yeah, Megan. So we can use await for fetch. Fetch is an like what you say an API provided by Node.js, using which we can call API, right? So not only for fetch API, rather for any asynchronous task, right? We can use await. maybe. We are not going to build any major project, rather a small project where teach you how to create a server, right? How to create routers, controller services, and what do you say? Mm, the main four operations, right? Create, read, update, delete. So when you will have a overview of these things, right? How to create all those things. So after that, you can deep dive into it and create more APIs, and you can expand that project to a major project. Please share repo link. Yeah, I'll be sharing the repo link. I guess you guys have one WhatsApp group, right? So I'll send to Manisha and he'll share that repo link to you guys. What about EJS templates and body parser? Okay, so basically EJS templates are used when we try to when we try to send some HTML files from backend to the client, right? Instead of HTML present in the front end, that so AGS is kind of mixture of HTML and JavaScript, right? Where you can inject some JavaScript variables, and it can accommodate in that HTML EGS that you have created, and then you can send that to the front end, and it can render that directly. If I'm able to answer, Murtikar. We'll talk about body parser and everything, and when we'll create a server tomorrow. Are you a blogger, sir? No, I'm not a full-time blogger, but I like to write things, articles about what I'm learning. So that's kind of notes for me to refer back. As like not everyone can learn everything, right? Uh, and I'm not good at remembering things. So I try to create notes for me so that I can refer back to when I'm needing that. So these things kind of, it was kind of a hobby for me, but then it some of the articles like kind of got viral, and some 45,000 people saw it. So I'm not that frequent. You can see like articles are October, then directly December, April, but I try to write whenever I learn. What is the difference between React and white React? Okay, so Megan, I have started using white recently, right? So React is basically a framework, okay, and white is kind of how that the kind of a bundler, I guess, similar to Webpack and these things, right? So when we write React codes, right, and end of the day, all those are compiled into one, right, and it is rendered in the web browser. So how that is happening, how those files are compiled into one file and it is rendered. So white is something new which kind of optimizes that thing so that the rendering and everything is faster than the initial ways. I have LinkedIn, but I'm not that active. I'm active on Twitter though. You can always connect with me there. I guess we have already crossed 12 minutes. So I'll be stopping now, and I'll be handing over to Manisha. If you have any questions, then please send in the group. I'll try to answer. I'll ask Manisha to add me in that group, and I'll try to answer your questions in the group. Over to you, Manisha.
Thank you so much, sir, for sharing your knowledge with us, for laying the foundation of Node.js, Express.js, and MongoDB. So, thank you guys for joining. Make sure you are revising things today, what our instructor shared with you, so that tomorrow you would be able to implement these skills practically. Thank you so much for joining. We will meet again tomorrow at 6:30 sharp. Thank you, guys. And for the attendance link, it will be shared in the description of this YouTube video. And all the vlogs and all the PPT that you want, it will be shared to you within tomorrow. Yeah. Thank you, guys.